After Tata-Mistry's removal as director on board of Tata Sons, today was the first day of hearing at the National Company Law Tribunal. The tribunal was to address two issues today: whether the petition filed by the two Tata-Mistry firms is maintainable, and if it is not, can the tribunal or will the tribunal exercise its discretion and waive the 10% threshold required to bring an oppression and mismanagement case. After a whole hour of discussion on whether the tribunal should hear maintainability first, rule on it and then move on to waiver, both sides of the councils agreed to argue on maintainability first. And here are the top 5 key highlights of what the arguments were from the both sides today. Abhishek Manu Singhvi, the counsel for Tata Sons, focused on the object of section 244 that lays down the 10% threshold requirement to bring an oppression and mismanagement case. He said that the legislature has done a cost-benefit analysis and has come to the conclusion that the harm to a company will be more than a benefit to a shareholder if anybody or everybody below 10% is allowed to bring an action of oppression and mismanagement. In his second argument, he dissected the numbers in terms of the value. He said that the total pot of shares issued by Tata Sons is worth 335 crores, of which 294 crores is preference shares and 40 crores is equity shares. So 2.1% is what, according to Tata Sons, Mistry side holds in terms of value, which is not substantial. The third argument that Abhishek Manu Singhvi made was that, look, the Act doesn't make a distinction between equity and preference shareholder as far as the definition of issued capital, member of a company and stock of shares is concerned. And where the Act wanted to distinguish between two classes of shareholders, it has done so by specifying it. In the fourth argument, he emphasized that the Old Companies Act and the New Companies Act says 10% of issued share capital. That's the threshold for bringing an oppression and mismanagement case. Now, he said that the Bombay High Court and the Supreme Court have interpreted that to mean issued share capital means preference shares and equity shares, and the tribunal hence is bound by this jurisprudence. The last argument that a counsel and not Dr. Singhvi made from the Tata Sons side was that, look, if you are saying, you here they were referring to the Mistry side, that the company's actions are prejudicial to a class of members, then the entire class of members should be aggrieved, which is not the case, because on 6th Feb EGM, according to Tata Sons, the equity shareholders voted out Mistry from the board. Let me now take you through the top 5 arguments made by C.A. Sundaram on behalf of the Mistry side. The whole thrust of Mr. Sundaram's argument was that, look, this new, the 2013 is the new Act. Please don't look at the old Act and the jurisprudence on it and get influenced by it. He started off by saying, pointing to section 241B, and he is saying that, look, there is a departure in the legislative intent. While the corresponding provision, the earlier provision, only addressed public interest and interest of a company, the new section expands the scope to include any class of shareholders, debenture holders and creditors, and hence the threshold, the 10% threshold, should hence be looked with regards to a certain class. In his case, 10% should be looked for the equity shareholders. The second argument that C.A. Sundaram made was that if the calculation of the respondent is upheld, that the Mistry firm's shareholding can be brought down to 1% from currently 18% if the majority decides to issue more preference shares. The third argument that C.A. Sundaram made was, and he picked it on what the counsel of Tata Sons said in terms of the value of the company. He said, look, the value of the company lies with equity shareholders and not preference shareholders. He referred to the action of to the argument of the Tata Sons counsel that and said that this substantial interest lies with equity shareholders and not preference shareholders. The fourth argument that C.A. Sundaram made was that 2016 accounting standards say that compulsorily redeemable preference shares are debt and share capital can never be debt. So, preference shares cannot be included in share capital. The last argument that C.A. Sundaram made was that the Act gives the tribunal the discretion to waive the 10% threshold, and since this discretion exists, the 10% threshold requirement is not mandatory. Stay tuned for more updates on the NCLT proceedings right here on Bloomberg Quint.